There are matches where defeat arrives through tactical mistakes. And then there are matches where defeat arrives because one team stops believing they deserve to compete. Heidenheim did not lose this match to Bayern Munich through individual errors or strategic miscalculation. They lost it through psychological surrender disguised as defensive pragmatism. This match exposed a truth that most mid-table clubs refuse to acknowledge when facing elite opposition. The truth is this: there exists a moment in certain matches where competitive ambition transforms into damage limitation, where the mentality shifts from how do we win to how do we survive. And once that shift occurs, survival itself becomes impossible. Heidenheim reached that moment long before the final whistle, possibly before the opening whistle, and everything that followed was merely confirmation. What makes this psychological collapse notable is not its existence. Every weaker team experiences doubt against stronger opposition, but rather its timing and totality. Heidenheim did not wait for adversity to abandon their competitive identity. They entered this fixture already convinced that containment represented success, that limiting damage constituted achievement, that survival equaled victory. This is the mindset of a team that has already accepted defeat as the likely outcome and decided that how they lose matters more than whether they fight to avoid losing. The difference between pragmatic defense and psychological capitulation lies in intent. Pragmatic defense seeks to frustrate, to disrupt rhythm, to create moments of transition that can be exploited. Psychological capitulation seeks only to delay the inevitable, to minimize embarrassment, to reach the final whistle with dignity intact. Heidenheim chose the latter, and in doing so, they guaranteed that dignity would be the first casualty. What appeared on the surface as defensive organization was, in reality, defensive paralysis. There is a critical distinction that separates structured defending from passive hoping, and Heidenheim demonstrated that distinction throughout this match. Organized defense requires aggression in pressure, precision in positioning, and courage in decision-making. What Heidenheim offered was bodies behind the ball without purpose, numbers in defensive areas without conviction, and shape without substance. The psychological element becomes evident when examining not what Heidenheim did defensively, but what they refused to attempt offensively. A team that genuinely believes in their defensive structure uses that structure as a foundation for counterattacking threat. They defend deep not because they fear their opponent's attack, but because they trust their ability to transition quickly when possession is recovered. Heidenheim defended deep because they feared everything: the opponent's technical superiority, their own limitations, the consequences of taking risks, the humiliation of being exposed. This fear manifested in the complete absence of forward ambition. When possession was recovered, there was no urgency to advance, no willingness to commit players forward, no belief that attacks could be constructed. Instead, clearances replaced passes, safety replaced creativity, and survival instinct replaced competitive drive. This is not tactical discipline. This is psychological defeat wearing the mask of tactical caution. Bayern Munich did not win this match through moments of individual brilliance or tactical innovation. They won through systematic application of pressure against an opponent who had already decided that resistance was futile. When one team commits fully to attack and the other commits fully to survival, the outcome becomes procedural rather than competitive. Bayern simply processed the match like a training exercise, applying pressure in predictable patterns against opposition that offered no unexpected resistance. The manner of Bayern's victory reveals as much about Heidenheim's psychology as the margin. Elite teams often struggle against opposition that defends with organized aggression, that presses with coordinated intensity, that makes defensive actions uncomfortable and attacking actions unpredictable. Bayern faced none of these challenges because Heidenheim offered none of these resistances. Every defensive action was reactive rather than proactive. Every clearance was desperate rather than calculated. Every moment of possession was surrendered rather than protected. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy where Heidenheim's fear of being overwhelmed guaranteed that they would be overwhelmed. By retreating into pure survival mode, they eliminated the unpredictability that gives weaker teams any chance against stronger opposition. They became entirely readable, completely predictable, and therefore easily dismantled. Bayern did not need to produce their best performance because Heidenheim's psychological state ensured that competent execution would suffice. This match serves as a case study in how psychological inferiority becomes self-perpetuating. Heidenheim entered this fixture convinced they could not compete on equal terms, so they abandoned equality entirely and settled for damage limitation. The predictable result of this approach, comprehensive defeat, will reinforce the belief that competing on equal terms was never possible, which will ensure that the same psychological capitulation occurs in future matches against elite opposition. The tragedy is that this mental framework prevents teams like Heidenheim from ever discovering their actual limitations. They never test whether their tactical approach could trouble elite teams because they never implement a tactical approach designed to trouble elite teams. They never discover whether their players possess the quality to compete at higher levels because they never ask their players to attempt competition at higher levels. They accept inferiority as fact without ever challenging that assumption through committed action. What makes this particularly damaging is that mid-table clubs often possess more quality than their psychology allows them to express. Players who can execute complex tactical instructions, who can maintain possession under pressure, who can create attacking opportunities through coordinated movement. These same players become passive, reactive, and timid when their team's collective mentality shifts into survival mode. The psychological environment determines performance more than individual ability, and Heidenheim's psychological environment was saturated with defeat before the match began. There exists a dangerous comfort in losing respectably to elite opposition. Clubs convince themselves that limiting the margin of defeat represents a form of success, that avoiding humiliation constitutes a positive result, that surviving without complete collapse deserves recognition. This mindset transforms defeat from an unacceptable outcome into an expected and even respectable conclusion. Heidenheim has embraced this comfort fully. The problem with this approach is that it creates a ceiling that can never be broken. If the goal against elite opposition is merely to avoid embarrassment rather than to compete for results, then competing for results becomes impossible. The team's preparation focuses on damage limitation rather than tactical disruption. The player's mentality emphasizes caution over courage. The collective approach prioritizes safety over ambition. And the inevitable result is exactly what this match produced: systematic defeat that feels somehow acceptable because it matches expectations. This psychological trap explains why certain clubs remain perpetually mid-table despite possessing resources that should enable upward mobility. They have accepted their station not through lack of quality, but through lack of psychological ambition. They measure success against lowered expectations rather than actual potential. They celebrate survival when they should demand competition. And they reinforce their own limitations through repeated psychological surrender in matches where belief and courage might create unexpected opportunities. The most significant consequence of this match extends beyond the points lost or the goals conceded. The real damage occurs in the reinforcement of a psychological pattern that will define Heidenheim's trajectory for the remainder of the season and potentially beyond. Every future match against elite opposition will carry the memory of this capitulation, and that memory will make similar capitulation more likely, more comfortable, more automatic. This creates a vicious cycle where psychological defeat becomes normalized. Players begin to internalize the belief that certain opponents cannot be genuinely challenged, that certain matches are predetermined, that certain outcomes are inevitable regardless of effort or approach. Coaches begin to frame defensive survival as tactical intelligence rather than competitive surrender. Supporters begin to accept comprehensive defeats as the natural price of competing at this level. And the club collectively abandons the psychological aggression necessary to ever break through these self-imposed limitations. What this match demonstrated is that psychological barriers are more restrictive than tactical or technical limitations. Heidenheim may lack Bayern's individual quality, financial resources, or squad depth, but these gaps are not insurmountable obstacles to competitive performance in a single match. What is insurmountable is the belief that competition itself is futile, that resistance is pointless, that survival represents the highest realistic ambition. Once that belief takes hold, no tactical adjustment or technical improvement can compensate for the absence of competitive psychology. The question this match raises is whether an alternative approach might have produced a different outcome. Could Heidenheim have competed more effectively by abandoning defensive passivity and embracing competitive risk? The answer is almost certainly yes, though not in terms of guaranteed results, but in terms of psychological positioning and future trajectory. Consider what competing to win rather than defending to survive would require. It would demand high defensive pressure to disrupt Bayern's possession-building rhythm. It would require committed forward runners to create transitional threats that force Bayern into defensive decisions. It would necessitate aggressive set-piece execution to generate scoring opportunities from limited possession phases. It would depend on psychological courage to continue attacking even after falling behind, refusing to accept defeat as inevitable regardless of scoreline. This approach carries obvious risks. Bayern might exploit the spaces created by aggressive pressure. Individual quality might overwhelm committed but technically inferior defenders. Tactical gambles might fail spectacularly. The final margin of defeat might be larger than what passive defense produces. But these risks must be weighed against the certainty that passive defense against elite opposition produces systematic defeat without creating any pathway toward unexpected success. More importantly, competing aggressively regardless of opponent quality establishes a psychological identity that serves the team in matches where success is more achievable. Players who are coached to surrender against elite teams will unconsciously carry that mentality into matches against equal or lesser opposition. The habit of psychological capitulation, once established, does not conveniently disappear when facing more favorable matchups. It becomes embedded in the team's character, limiting performance even in situations where competitive psychology should produce positive results. This match is not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of a systemic problem within mid-table football culture. Too many clubs at this level have internalized the belief that their role is to compete among themselves while accepting inevitable defeat against elite opposition. This creates a two-tier mentality where psychological approach varies based on opponent quality rather than maintaining consistent competitive aggression regardless of opponent. The acceptance of this two-tier approach is presented as realism, as understanding the natural hierarchy of football, as acknowledging financial and technical disparities that cannot be overcome. But this framing ignores the fundamental reality that single matches are not decided by season-long resources, but by 90-minute performances. Leicester City won the Premier League not because they accumulated resources equal to elite clubs, but because they refused to accept psychological inferiority in individual matches. They competed as if victory was possible in every match, and that psychological approach created results that resource disparity suggested were impossible. Heidenheim and clubs like them will never achieve Leicester's extraordinary success, but that is not the relevant comparison. The relevant comparison is between what they achieve with their current psychology of accepted inferiority versus what they might achieve with a psychology of relentless competition. The gap between these two approaches likely amounts to several positions in the table, millions in revenue, and fundamentally different trajectories for club development and player growth. Beyond the collective consequences for the club, this psychological approach carries significant costs for individual players. Young players developing at mid-table clubs need matches against elite opposition to test themselves, to discover their limits, to measure their quality against the highest standards. When their team enters these matches already psychologically defeated, these developmental opportunities are wasted. A young defender who might possess the technical quality and mental strength to compete at elite levels will never discover that capability if his team's defensive approach is purely passive. A midfielder who might have the vision and courage to create attacking opportunities under pressure will never develop that aspect of his game if his team's mentality is entirely focused on ball retention without forward ambition. A forward who might have the movement intelligence and finishing quality to trouble top defenders will never refine these skills if his team never attempts to create attacking situations. This developmental limitation extends beyond technical and tactical growth. The psychological habituation to accepting defeat against quality opposition creates mental patterns that players carry throughout their careers. They learn to lower their own expectations based on opponent reputation rather than maintaining consistent self-belief regardless of opposition. They developed a habit of passive response rather than active aggression when facing superior individual talent. They internalized the belief that certain levels of football are beyond their reach, and this belief becomes self-fulfilling. The way forward for clubs trapped in this psychological pattern requires confronting uncomfortable truths about their own mentality and making deliberate choices to prioritize competitive psychology over comfortable mediocrity. This means accepting that competing aggressively against elite opposition might produce larger margins of defeat in the short term, but creates the psychological foundation for long-term improvement. It requires coaching that emphasizes consistent competitive approach regardless of opponent, refusing to make psychological concessions based on opposition quality. It demands player recruitment that values mental courage and competitive aggression as highly as technical ability. It necessitates supporter expectations that celebrate brave defeats over safe capitulations, that value fighting spirit over respectable scorelines. Most fundamentally, it requires rejecting the comfortable lie that current station represents inevitable destiny rather than accumulated psychological choices. Mid-table clubs remain mid-table not primarily because of financial limitations or technical inferiority, but because they have accepted psychological inferiority as permanent reality. This acceptance manifests in matches exactly like this one, where defeat arrives not through being outplayed, but through refusing to genuinely play. Heidenheim lost this match the moment they decided that competing to win was less important than defending to survive. And until they reject that psychology entirely, Bayern Munich will be only one of many teams that process them like a training exercise rather than respecting them as genuine competition.